The Old Covenant is certainly still valid. God's promises are unbreakable, but the Old Covenant is now fulfilled. What Christians don't believe is that God...
Jesus presumably knew the Old Testament very well. What would he say the Old Testament is?
I suppose.
There are quite a few books in the Old Testament that some Christian denominations accept that the Catholic canon has and others don't. Was that already a defined canon at the time of Jesus?
No, there wasn't a canon at the time of Jesus. You couldn't pick up a Bible. You could take out of its slot a scroll.
Does that change the way in which we read the books now, do you think?
Oh, that's an interesting question. I think it certainly...
So, given we have the New Testament and the New Covenant and Jesus Christ, why should we still read the Old Testament?
Well, Jesus proposes himself and is proposed by the New Testament as the fulfillment of God's promises. And those promises are contained in the Old Testament. So if you want to know what Jesus means, you have to know the Old Testament. Jesus Christ is the culmination of God's plan. He doesn't make the right kind of sense without the Old Testament. I'm hesitating to use the word background because it's not quite the right word, but I don't know what other word to use. Without the history behind him, just as you don't really know somebody until you know their history. Similarly, you don't really know the New Covenant until you know its history, and its history is in the history of God making covenants with his chosen people.
Jesus presumably knew the Old Testament very well as a Jew of the first century.
Quotes it all over the place, yes.
What would he say the Old Testament is?
I suppose he would probably, firstly, he'd use the word law, except that it doesn't really mean law. He would use the word Torah, and Torah really means instruction. And instruction, I always explain it as it's instruction in two senses. Instruction as in, I'm instructing you to do this, which is how we would take it, meaning law, but also instructions like an instruction manual. How do I use this food mixer? Well, I need to read the instructions. The law is the instruction manual for the human person. It's how to be a human being. And of course, the Old Testament contains so much more than law. So it's interesting that that word Torah is the word that's used to cover the whole of the Old Testament, including the law, the prophets, the histories, etc. Because I think fundamentally it's the story of God revealing himself to human beings in order to reveal to human beings what they are supposed to be, what their destiny and their purpose and function is in the world.
And as instruction and law, in what sense, in any, is it still instructive for us today? Do we still follow the laws of the Old Testament?
Well, some of them yes, and some of them no, as you probably know. We do not, for example, worry about circumcising our sons, except for medical necessity. We don't worry overly much about wearing clothes of mixed fibres. And obviously, most crucially, and this is, I think, where things are most different from how they were 2,000 years ago, we don't sacrifice animals and worry about how to arrange their bodies on a big bonfire in a temple in Jerusalem. This is what religion was 2,000 years ago for Jewish people, substantially. The Old Testament contains all sorts of different types of law, some of which are clearly purely ritual law, which are there to draw a line, if you will, around the Jewish people, to say these are the Jewish people, these are the chosen people of God, these are the covenant people, and they know who they are because there's this line drawn around them. And then there are plenty of other laws which obviously have wider application. Thou shalt not kill isn't something that's supposed to separate the Jewish people from other people, because God obviously doesn't want anybody to kill people. So we need to make a distinction as to the function of the law within the Old Testament. Now, you might say, well, we shouldn't need the Old Testament to tell us not to kill people. And of course, that's true, we shouldn't. But very often we do, because of sin, because we're all weak. So there's all sorts of stuff in the Old Testament which has ongoing moral significance within the laws, but more fundamentally, it seems to me, the Old Testament, all of it, points to Jesus. And therefore it helps to shine a light on him, to show us in relief, if you will, who he is and what he means.
And does it all point to Jesus in the same way? Is it all sort of straightforward prophecy and prediction?
No.
No.
There is prophecy of Christ, and there are prophecies which the earliest Christians, we see this happening in the New Testament, clearly used to help them to understand Jesus. So, for example, the prophecies of the suffering servant in Isaiah 52 to 53 helps the early Christians to understand the significance of Jesus' crucifixion. The Emmanuel prophecy earlier on in Isaiah helps us to understand that Jesus, as the son of a virgin, is God with us. And there's a million other prophecies that you can see fairly straightforwardly point to Jesus. But then there are all sorts of other ways in which Jesus is foreshadowed in the Old Testament, in which there are pre-echoes of Christ, which once we've recognized them as such, that not only helps us to understand the Old Testament better, but it also helps us to understand Jesus better, because we see a new side to him by seeing these foreshadowings of him, if that makes sense.
Yes, I think that does. And we talk about covenants is obviously very important in the Old Testament, and a series of covenants, and Jesus being the new covenant. Is the Old Covenant in any way still valid? What's the status of the Old Covenant?
Well, the Old Covenant is certainly still valid. God's promises are unbreakable, but the Old Covenant is now fulfilled. That doesn't mean it goes away. It means that it's fulfilled. So what Christians don't believe is that God kind of changed his mind, gave up on Judaism, gave up on Israel, gave up on the covenant with Moses and with David and so on, and started again with Christianity. Rather, what we claim is that Jesus Christ is precisely the fulfillment that the covenants with Israel looked forward to. So, for example, in the letter to the Hebrews, it quotes extensively from Jeremiah 31, which is the promise of a new covenant. And the point that Hebrews is making is the old covenant contains within itself the promise of a new covenant. So it doesn't mean that you're replacing the old covenant by having the new covenant. It means you're fulfilling it. It's exactly where God has always promised we would end up.
In terms of the Old Testament as a whole, we spoke in an earlier conversation about the canon of the New Testament. There are quite a few books in the Old Testament that some Christian denominations accept that the Catholic canon has and others don't. Was that already a defined canon at the time of Jesus?
No, there wasn't a canon at the time of Jesus. And indeed, there wasn't a Bible. You couldn't pick up a Bible in the time of Jesus. You could take out of its slot a scroll of one of the books of what we call the Bible, what Greek-speaking Jews called ta biblia, which is the books, or booklets, actually, because it's kind of a diminutive. So the booklets is what gives us the word Bible. So, for example, when Jesus reads from Isaiah in the covenant, in the synagogue in Nazareth, he's handed the scroll of Isaiah. It was only with the rise of Christianity that people started to put all of these things together in one volume. And of course, once you start to collect things together in one volume, you've got to decide what goes in and what doesn't. I suppose the nearest thing you have to a canon in the time of Christ is you have those books which had been translated into Greek and formed part of the Septuagint, which is what we call the Greek translation of the Old Testament. And that sort of came in 2 volumes. But really, generally speaking, what you had in Judaism was not so much a canon as clearly some books are definitely Bible, and then gradually it sort of peters out.
The boundaries are more porous.
The boundaries are porous. There are grey areas. So is the Book of Tobit a biblical book or not? It takes you until the Council of Trent to know that it is, because before then it was kind of moot.
Does that change the way in which we read the books now, do you think?
Oh, that's an interesting question. I think it certainly remains the case that we see some books as more central than others. Obviously, within the Christian canon, we would see the Gospels and the letters of St. Paul as being the most crucial texts. And then within the Old Testament, we would see the law and the prophets as of key significance. I think nobody thinks that the Song of Songs or the Book of Tobit is as important as the Book of Genesis or the Book of Exodus. But that doesn't mean that we don't read the Song of Songs or the Book of Tobit and look for Christ in them and look for the fulfillment of God's promises being foreshadowed in those books also. And to exclude a book because it's not central is just, well, it's silly, because they have been given to us to read, and they're all beautiful and marvellous in their own way.
Favourite book of the Old Testament?
My favourite book? Well, I mean, I have a soft spot for Leviticus, because my real area of expertise is the letter to the Hebrews, which is so dependent on Leviticus and its vision of the temple and the significance of the sacrificial cult and all of that kind of thing. I do like the Song of Songs, but I wouldn't want my mother to read it. It's a bit rude. And, you know, you've got to love the book of Genesis because it's got so many great stories.
It does, yeah. If just a final question, if someone's coming new to the Old Testament, really struggling to get to grips with it, where would you recommend starting?
Well, I would recommend starting at the beginning. Read the first few chapters of Genesis, maybe the first 12 chapters of Genesis to get you up to Abraham. But then don't try and finish the book of Genesis. We started on Genesis in a parish scripture group here, and we didn't finish it because, you know, it gets a bit boring, frankly. And my heart always sinks when somebody tells me they've decided to read the Bible from cover to cover, because I know even if they finish Genesis, they'll never get through Exodus because there's all this stuff about furniture. It's really boring. And that's fine to think it's boring. It's not meant to be exciting, all of it. It's, you know, theologically interesting in its own way for nerdy people like me. I would say read the book of Genesis, first 12 chapters maybe, and then skip to something like Isaiah. Read the first few chapters, say first 9 chapters of Isaiah, something like that. Get something very different. And for goodness sake, don't neglect the Psalms.
Thank you.